Hello, BookTube. It's week 3 of the Pentathon, created by Matt at Paperback Junkie. The easiest flip and readathon you'll ever do, according to him. Where we're just going to read the stuff he likes. And that'll be that. And the first week was Edgar Rice Burroughs, and that was a joy. And then the second week was H.P. Lovecraft. That was less of a joy. And then this week is Robert E. Howard. Which is, we're right back into joy territory. The task this week was to read something by Robert E. Howard. And since Robert E. Howard is mostly an author of short stories, that's not a great burden. So far, Matt's prediction that this will be the easiest flip and read along you ever do is kind of bearing out. It is pretty easy to do and lots of fun. It's been lots of fun. I wish that it were bigger. Wish more people were doing it, because this aspect of literature, this plot-oriented, adventure-themed, pulpy subgenre, sub-basement of literature is really important. It's a lot of fun as well, and it doesn't get the attention that it deserves. Matt's is one of the only channels devoted to it. But anyway, this week is Robert E. Howard, the creator of Kull, the Conqueror, and Bran McMorn, and Solomon Kane, and especially Conan the Barbarian. And for my Edgar Rice Burroughs read-along this time around, I chose Shadows in Zambula, which was published as the Man-Eaters of Zambula. In Weird Tales in 1935, it's a finished short story. Robert E. Howard's stack of work is littered with drafts and fragments and whatnot. But this is a finished story, and that starts off very simply. Conan is fairly young. He's in a desert town called Zambula, when he's approached by a lunatic in a market, telling him to beware the house of... how is the actual line? It's how the story actually begins. Peril hides in the house of Aram Baksh. And Conan wonders, well, what kind of peril? Conan doesn't care. He'll talk to anybody. He says, what kind of peril? And the man says, well, nobody really knows, but people who go there are never seen again. And he raises the specter of robbery, that it's a robber's den. And Conan says with the usual, the song for all that is such a classic example of his character. He says, well, I don't have anything to steal. I just sold my horse. All he has is his sword. And the place is cheap. And there's also an element of, maybe I'm going to show that I'm not afraid. So he goes to the house of Aram Baksh in order to rent a tiny little dingy room and spend the night. And sure enough, in the middle of the night, a freakish form approaches silently. Conan springs up and kills the person right away. No questions asked, no turning on the light, no who goes there. And when he sees who it is, he realizes that it's a cannibal, a famous cannibal of a cannibal tribe. And starts to wonder if maybe that's what's going on here, that maybe cannibals frequent the house of Aram Baksh, and that's why the whole town of Zambula locks itself up securely at night. That's why people go missing. Maybe, he thinks. But anyway, he's not going to stay there. So he goes out into the street and meets a half-naked woman who's screaming for help because she has given a love potion to her lover, but instead of making him amorous, it has made him insane. She mixed things wrong or whatever. Her story's not very convincing, but she pleads with Conan to help her to find him, and he eventually does. But it leads to a subplot in which there's mesmerism, and she ends up in a wonderfully creepy scene. She ends up being forced to dance inside a square of poisonous snakes who are swaying. Every time she comes near to one, it strikes, and she pulls away, but that brings her close to another, and it strikes, and it looks horrifying. It's a horrifying moment. It made the cover of Weird Tales. That scene made the cover of Weird Tales when this story originally appeared. And that means that there's a whole separate bad guy that Conan has to face. For a minute, the story derails from what's going on in the house of Aram Baksh to the semi-sorcerous bad guy who has hypnotized the heroine and who's enlisted these snakes. And he has another helper. This bad guy has another helper. He has a gigantic man called Baal Petor. Who that is not his real name. There's one point where he says that it's just the name that he chose. Yes, I am Baal Petor, the man answered. Once long ago in another land I had another name, but this is a good name, and why Tortramesk gave it to me, any temple wench can tell you. It turns out that Baal Petor is a born and raised member of a clan of stranglers. He's been trained since childhood to be a strangler with his bare hands, not with an instrument. And inevitably, he fights with Conan, and it's a noteworthy moment because Conan's not a supernatural figure himself. He fights the supernatural all the time, but he himself is not a supernatural figure. He's from Samaria. He was born on a battlefield, raised as close to a wild animal as possible, and has seen military hardship from a very early age for his whole life. He's huge, and he's enormously powerful, but he is a man. He isn't a normal mortal man. Even so, there's almost never a time in any of the Conan stories where he is physically given trouble by another normal man. He's given trouble by dinosaurs, or monsters, or creatures with invulnerable hides, or whatever. But ordinary men he dispatches easily. And that's what makes this moment all the more memorable, because eventually, inevitably, he comes to grips with Baal Petor. Your head, Cimmerian, taunted Baal Petor. I shall take it with my bare hands, twisting it from your shoulder as the head of a fowl is twisted. Thus the sons of Kosala offer sacrifice to Yajur. Barbarian, you look upon the strangler of Yotapong. I was chosen by the priests of Yajur in my infancy, and throughout childhood, boyhood, and youth, I was trained in the art of slaying with the naked hands, for only thus are the sacrifices enacted. Yajur loves blood, and we waste not a drop from the victim's veins. When I was a child, they gave me infants to throttle. When I was a boy, I strangled young girls. As a youth, women, old men, and young boys. Not until I reached full manhood was I given a strong man to slay on the altar of Yotapong. For years I offered the sacrifices to Yajur. Hundreds of necks have snapped between these fingers. He worked them before the Cimmerian's angry eyes. Why I fled from Yotapong to become Totramic's servant is no concern of yours. In a moment you will be beyond curiosity. The priests of Kosala, the stranglers of Yajur, are strong beyond the belief of men. And I was stronger than any. With my hands, barbarian, I shall break your neck. And like a stroke of twin cobras, the great hands closed on Conan's throat. The Cimmerian made no attempt to dodge or fend them away, but his own hands darted to the Kosalan's bull neck. Baal Petor's black eyes widened as he felt the thick cords of muscle that protected the barbarian's throat. With a snarl, he exerted his inhuman strength, and knots and lumps and ropes of thews rose along his massive arms. And then a choking gasp burst from him as Conan's fingers locked on his throat. For an instant, they stood there like statues, their faces masks of effort, veins beginning to stand out purply on their temples. Conan's thin lips drew back from his teeth in the grinning snarl. Baal Petor's eyes were distended. In them grew an awful surprise and the glimmer of fear. Both men stood motionless as images, except for the expanding of their muscles on rigid arms and braced legs, but the strength beyond common conception was warring there, strength that might have uprooted trees and crushed the skulls of bullocks. The wind whistled suddenly from between Baal Petor's parted teeth. His face was growing purple. Fear flooded his eyes. His thews seemed ready to burst from his arms and shoulders, yet the muscles of the Cimmerian's thick neck did not give. They felt like masses of woven iron cords under his desperate fingers, but his own flesh was giving way under the iron fingers of the Cimmerian, which ground deeper and deeper into the yielding throat muscles, crushing them upon a jugular and windpipe. The statuesque immobility of the group gave way to sudden frenzied motion as the Kosalan began to wrench and heave, seeking to throw himself backward. He let go of Conan's throat and grasped his wrists, trying to tear away those inexorable fingers. With a sudden lunge, Conan bore him backward until the small of his back crashed against the table, and still farther over its edge Conan bent him, back and back, until his spine was ready to snap. Conan's low laugh was merciless as a ring of steel. "You fool," he all but whispered. "I think you never saw a man from the West before. Did you deem yourself strong because you were able to twist the heads off civilized folk, poor weaklings with muscles rotted like string? Hell, break the neck of a wild Cimmerian bull, you call yourself strong. I did that before I was a full-grown man. Like this." And with a savage wrench, he twisted Baal Petor's head around until the ghastly face leered over the left shoulder. and the vertebrae snapped like a rotten branch. Now, the rest of the plot works out just fine. Conan finds the madman lover, sees right through the disguise of the woman and her lover, steals from them without their knowledge, and is away from town before they can even suspect it. So we have the wily guy who thinks on his feet, the thief, the reaver. But that is the key moment of the story, is that moment, Robert E. Howard had the sense not to have Conan just kill this guy with a sword. You can't do that. If you have a character like Conan, he has to win in that encounter. He has to win in sword fights. There are a couple of stories in the Conan legendarium where he fights technically better swordsmen than himself, and he wins through brute strength and perseverance and the ability to take punishment. But when it comes to a character like this, and notice Conan is bragging in that moment when he's got his enemy at his mercy. He's bragging, saying, you're used to dealing with weaklings. Did you never face anyone from the West before? And it's overcompensating because he has obviously had trouble with this guy, or it would have been over in a few seconds. They were equals for a few minutes. That's a lot more than most people can say in a contest with Conan the Barbarian. So Howard had to have that moment work right. It had to be mano a mano. And that's the sort of, almost every great Conan story comes down to a bald moment like that. That's why I love them so much. That's why I think they're evergreen. So it's going to be a little bit sad to leave Conan behind here as week 3 of Pentathon comes to an end. Week 4 is to read something noirish, to read a hard-boiled detective story, or a noir detective story. And that'll be fun in its own right. I have a bunch of those in a whole bunch of different collections, so I will pick one, something short, and read it this week. And then the last is to read a comic book. The last challenge of Pentathon is to read a comic book. Still don't know what I'm going to do about that, but for this, it was a pure joy to read the Shadows in Zambula from 1935. It was a pure joy. It works perfectly well. So I'm gonna wrap this up for now. But I will see you soon. Thank you, BookTube.